Far to the north of the Hindu Kush, where the Amu Darya's waters spread across wide alluvial plains, lay the ancient region of Bactria, a land that would one day be remembered in legend as the land of 1,000 cities. Even in the earliest ages of recorded history, long before it was absorbed into the machinery of great empires, Bactria possessed a quiet but undeniable significance. Fertile river valleys, flanked by mountains and fed by a complex network of streams and irrigation channels, made this place an oasis of agriculture in an otherwise harsh Central Asian landscape. The Oxus River, known today as the Amu Darya, was the lifeblood of the region, carrying snowmelt from the high palmiers down to the plains, where fields of wheat, barley, and millet thrived. This was no isolated agricultural pocket. Rather, Bactria's position placed it along the arteries of ancient trade, connecting the Iranian plateau to the steppes of Central Asia and the markets of distant lands. Even before the rise of formal states, its valleys supported dense clusters of villages and proto-urban centers, bound together not by a central authority, but by shared economic interests, kinship ties, and the constant movement of goods and ideas. To the south, across the rugged passes of the Hindu Kush and into the warmer, arid expanse of what is now southern Afghanistan, stretched Arachosia, a land defined by the Helmand River. The Helmand, like the Oxus, was a giver of life in a dry country, winding for hundreds of kilometers through desert and steppe, before emptying into a vast inland basin. Arachosia's fertile floodplains made it a strategic prize. Whoever controlled them could regulate the passage of goods moving between the Iranian plateau and the Indian subcontinent. This was not merely a corridor for merchants, it was a gateway between worlds. To the west lay the heartlands of Elam and Mesopotamia. To the east, the wealth of the Indus cities. To the north, the pastoral nomads and mountain peoples whose herds roamed the highlands. Arachosia's location made it both a crossroads and a buffer, a place where multiple civilizations brushed shoulders and sometimes collided. Yet, in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE, neither Bactria nor Arachosia were kingdoms in the sense familiar to Mesopotamia or Egypt. There were no single monarchs commanding vast armies or issuing decrees over a unified land. Instead, both regions were mosaics of small-scale political entities, towns surrounded by agricultural lands, tribes clustered around seasonal pastures, and market centers where artisans and traders exchanged their wares. These communities were bound together in loose confederations, often by common ancestry or mutual defense, but lacking the hierarchical bureaucracies that defined the great riverine civilizations to the west. Still, these networks of towns and tribes laid the foundation for the states that would emerge centuries later under the banners of the Achaemenids, the Greeks, and the Kushans. In Bactria, the earliest archaeological traces of settled life date back to the Neolithic period, when farming villages emerged in the foothills and river valleys. The so-called Bactria Margiana archaeological complex BMAC, which flourished in the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia BCE, reveals a landscape dotted with fortified towns, monumental architecture, and sophisticated craft production. Sites such as Dashley and Shortagai demonstrate that Bactria was already integrated into far-reaching trade networks. Shortagai, located near the Kaka River, served as a trading post for lapis lazuli, the deep blue gemstone prized in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Lapis from the mines of Badakhshan passed through Bactria, carried by caravans that wound their way across mountains and deserts, exchanging the stone for textiles, metals, and other commodities. The wealth generated by this trade not only enriched local elites but also fostered a cultural milieu in which foreign influences mingled with indigenous traditions. The rivers of Bactria did more than water the fields. They also served as conduits for movement and exchange. Seasonal floods deposited rich silt, sustaining agriculture in a region otherwise hemmed in by arid lands. Farmers cultivated barley, wheat, lentils, and grapes, while herders tended cattle, sheep, and goats in the surrounding grasslands. Irrigation systems, some of which survive in modified form to this day, allowed communities to expand their arable land, supporting higher populations and more complex social structures. Over time, some settlements grew into proto-cities there, walls enclosing not only homes, but also workshops, granaries, and temples. The presence of monumental architecture suggests the emergence of religious and political leaders who could mobilize labor on a large scale, perhaps through a blend of spiritual authority and clan leadership. In Arachosia, the story was similar in outline but distinct in detail. The Helmand River Valley was home to one of the earliest urban centers in the region. Mundigak excavations there reveal layers of occupation stretching back to the 4th millennium BCE, with evidence of planned streets, large public buildings, and intricate pottery. Mundigak's material culture bears traces of contact with the Indus Valley civilization seals. Ornaments and certain pottery styles suggest that merchants from Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro were regular visitors. Arachosia's location at the juncture of multiple ecological zones, river valley, desert, and mountain, allowed its inhabitants to exploit a diverse range of resources. Farmers cultivated cereals and dates in the irrigated lowlands, while herders grazed their flocks in the uplands. Copper from nearby deposits, along with semi-precious stones, fed into regional trade networks that extended far beyond the Helmand Basin. Though politically fragmented, both Bactria and Arachosia exhibited signs of increasing social complexity during this period. In Bactria, fortified settlements indicate a concern for defense, perhaps against raiding pastoralists or rival communities. The scale of fortifications varied. Some towns had simple mud brick walls, while others boasted multiple defensive layers and towers. In Arachosia, the layout of Mundigak suggests not only defensive planning but also centralized coordination in construction, hinting at a proto-ban administrative system. Yet the absence of writing in both regions, during this early phase, limits our understanding of their political organization. Without written records, archaeologists rely on material remains to reconstruct the nature of leadership. The prevailing view is that authority rested in the hands of local chiefs, whose power derived from control over resources, religious prestige, and the ability to organize collective projects, such as irrigation, canals, and fortifications. The religious life of these early societies remains only partially understood, but certain patterns emerge from the archaeological record. In Bactria, temples and shrines often occupied central positions within settlements, indicating that ritual activity was a focal point of community life. Some scholars suggest that elements of early Zoroastrian belief, reverence for fire, the sun, and natural elements, may have been present, though formal Zoroastrianism as we know it developed later. Burial practices in both regions reveal distinctions in status. Some graves contain rich assemblages of goods, including weapons, jewelry, and fine ceramics, while others are modest, suggesting social stratification. The artistry of metalwork, particularly in gold and bronze, points to both local skill and the importation of stylistic motifs from neighboring cultures. Trade was the lifeblood of both Bactria and Arachosia, knitting them into a wider world. Caravans moving through Bactria carried lapis lazuli, tin, and high-quality horses northward and westward, while importing silver, woolen textiles, and manufactured goods. Arachosia, acting as a bridge between Iran and India, facilitated the exchange of cotton, textiles, ivory, spices, and precious woods from the Indus Valley with metals and manufactured goods from the Iranian plateau. This commercial activity not only brought material wealth but also ideas, artistic techniques, religious concepts, and even new crops traveled along these same routes. The cultural landscapes of Bactria and Arachosia were thus products of constant interaction, blending indigenous traditions with foreign innovations over the centuries. The gradual consolidation of power in certain centers laid the groundwork for the emergence of true kingdoms. In Bactria, the clustering of fortified towns along key river routes fostered alliances and rivalries that could evolve into more centralized polities. In Arachosia, the strategic control of river crossings and trade hubs gave certain communities leverage over others. Though still far from the bureaucratic states of later times, these proto-kingdoms represented a significant step in political evolution. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, both regions had the infrastructure, population density, and economic base to attract the attention of expanding empires. When the Achaemenid Persians came in the 6th century BCE, they found in Bactria and Arachosia not untamed frontiers, but thriving, sophisticated societies, ready to be integrated into an imperial framework. The legacy of these early centuries cannot be overstated. The agricultural techniques perfected in Bactria and Arachosia would sustain their populations for millennia. The trade routes they nurtured would form the backbone of later Silk Road networks. Their art, religion, and social organization would influence and be influenced by the great cultures of the ancient world. In many ways, the story of Afghanistan's later history, its role as a crossroads, a prize for conquerors, and a melting pot of peoples, was already written in the age when Bactria and Arachosia were but loose networks of towns and tribes. The seeds of empire lay hidden in their fertile valleys and bustling markets, waiting for the moment when history's tide would draw them into the orbit of the world's great powers. Chapter 7. Trade and the Proto-Silk roads clung stubbornly to the ridges above the narrow pass. Even though spring had warmed the valleys below, the wind here carried the scent of stone and ice, and the caravan moved slowly, each step of the pack animals deliberate and cautious on the rocky path. The led camel, draped in woven blankets dyed in muted reds and browns, carried 2 tightly sealed bundles, raw lapis lazuli, from the mines of Badakhshan, its deep blue hidden from view but destined to glimmer in temples far to the west. Behind it, donkeys bore sacks of tin ingots from the steppes beyond the Oxus, their dull gray sheen promising new bronze tools and weapons, once mixed with copper in the workshops of distant Mesopotamia. The merchants walked alongside their animals, speaking in a mix of tongues, some from the high valleys, others from the Iranian plateau, and one man whose accent hinted at the Indus plain. None had traveled the entire route before, yet each knew that Afghanistan's passes, valleys, and river corridors were the only way to move such treasures between worlds. This was long before the name Silk Road would be coined. But the lifeblood of long-distance commerce was already pulsing through these rugged lands. Afghanistan's position at the heart of Asia is a geographical truth as much as a historical one. Wedged between the highlands of Central Asia, the Iranian plateau, and the plains of South Asia, it forms both a barrier and a bridge. To the north, the Amu Darya, the ancient Oxus, gathers the meltwaters of the Pamirs and winds through fertile Bactria, its banks lined with fields and orchards. To the south, the Helmand River cuts across Arachosia's arid plains, feeding a green ribbon of life into the desert. Between them rise the Hindu Kush Mountains, their spines broken only by narrow passes, the Selong, the Shabar, the Kawak, the Khyber in the east, and the Bolan further south. These passes are treacherous, snowbound in winter, dangerous with rockfalls in spring, but they are the keys to movement. For merchants in the Bronze Age, there was no way to reach from Central Asia to the Indus, or from Mesopotamia to the Tarim Basin, without threading through Afghanistan's labyrinth of mountains and valleys. The commodities that moved along these routes were as diverse as the landscapes they crossed. Lapis lazuli from Badakhshan was perhaps the most famous. This vivid blue stone, flecked with golden pyrite, had been mined from the Sarisang quarries for millennia. Even in the 4th millennium BCE, beads of lapis traveled to Mesopotamia, where they adorned the graves of Yours, queens, and to Egypt. where they were ground into pigment for the eyes of statues and the jewelry of pharaohs. The demand for lapis was insatiable, and its source in the remote mountains of northeastern Afghanistan made it one of the most valuable commodities of the ancient world. But lapis was only one thread in this early web of exchange. Tin, vital for making bronze, was carried from Central Asian sources, possibly from the Zaravshan Valley and beyond, through Bactria and down into the Iranian plateau. Without tin, copper was soft and prone to bending. With it, smiths could forge harder, sharper, more durable tools and weapons. This alloy revolutionized agriculture, warfare, and craftsmanship, and the tin routes were as strategically important as any later silk or spice corridor. From the Pamirs came other treasures: nephrite, jade, turquoise, and carnelian beads, each with markets in different lands. From the Indus Valley traveled cotton textiles, ivory combs, and finely carved shell ornaments. In return, Mesopotamian merchants sent woolens, silver, and crafted goods eastward, while nomadic herders from the steppes brought horses and furs into the mix. Moving these goods required more than knowledge of the terrain. It demanded organization, negotiation, and protection. Early merchants rarely traveled alone. Caravans were often organized in seasonal waves, setting out after the snows had melted, but before the summer heat turned the valleys into furnaces. They moved in stages, stopping at way stations near water sources, some little more than a cluster of tents, others small fortified towns that doubled as markets. Here, local chiefs exerted their authority, offering safe passage in exchange for tribute or tolls. Sometimes this took the form of direct payment in goods: a few ingots of tin, a bundle of lapis, a bolt of cloth, while at other times, merchants were required to purchase overpriced supplies from the chief's own storehouses. The power to grant or deny access to a pass was a potent source of wealth, and some communities thrived for generations on the proceeds of taxing trade. Archaeological evidence confirms the depth and complexity of these exchanges. At the site of Shortagai, on the Kaka River in northern Afghanistan, excavations have revealed a settlement that functioned as an Indus trading outpost in the late 3rd millennium BCE. Here, artifacts such as Indus-style weights, seals, and pottery were found alongside locally sourced lapis lazuli, indicating that this was a hub where Indian merchants acquired lapis directly from the mines and shipped it west. At Mundagak, in Arachosia, the material culture includes both Indus and Iranian elements, suggesting that it was a node on the southern trade corridor, linking the Helmand Valley to the Makran coast and the Persian Gulf. Even more intriguingly, in Bactria, BMAC sites like Dashli have yielded Mesopotamian cylinder seals, hinting at contact, whether direct or mediated, between Central Asian towns and Sumerian or Akkadian traders. The routes themselves were more like braided rivers than single roads. Merchants could choose different paths depending on the season, the political climate, or the nature of their cargo. Heavy goods moved along the lower valleys where pack animals could travel more easily, while lighter high-value items might be carried by small, fast caravans over higher passes to avoid tolls or raids. In the east, the Khyber Pass linked the Kabul Valley to the Indus Plain, and from there to the Harappan cities. In the north, the route through the Wakhan corridor led toward the Tarim Basin, though this was more treacherous and used less frequently in the earliest periods. The central routes, through Bamiyan, the Shabar Pass, and down to the Helmand connected Bactria to Arachosia, allowing goods to bypass the harsh deserts of southern Iran. Danger was ever present. Landslides, sudden snowstorms, and swollen rivers could wipe out entire caravans. Banditry was a constant threat, and the distinction between a local toll collector and a brigand was often blurred. To mitigate risks, merchants sometimes hired armed escorts or paid protection money to powerful tribes along the route. Over time, Certain waypoints evolved into proto-caravanserized walled compounds where travelers could rest, store goods, and find fresh animals. While these were rudimentary compared to the grand inns of the later Silk Road era, they were crucial for sustaining long-distance trade. The movement of goods also carried with it the movement of ideas. Decorative motifs traveled with artisans, influencing local styles of pottery, metalwork, and textiles. Religious symbols, the solar disk, the sacred mountain, the fire altar, appeared in regions far from their origin, testifying to the spread of beliefs and rituals. Technological innovations, too, moved along these proto-routes. New metallurgical techniques, weaving patterns, and methods of irrigation could leap across mountains and deserts on the backs of traders. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, the web of trade that crisscrossed Afghanistan had become dense and resilient enough that it would later form the skeleton of the Silk Road. When the Achaemenid Empire expanded into Bactria and Arachosia in the 6th century BCE, they inherited not a blank map, but a living network of trade corridors. The Persians improved the infrastructure, building roads, standardizing weights and measures, and offering imperial protection, but the routes themselves had been in use for over 1,000 years. Later still, the Greco-Bactrian kings and the Kushans would exploit these same arteries to move silk, spices, and ideas between China, India, and the Mediterranean. The Proto-Silk Road, in other words, was not a precursor in name only. It was the enduring foundation of Afghanistan's role as a crossroads of civilization.